something different that requires not just a revision of borders, but also many ways of ourselves. He offers a bold possibility that another world is possible, or as he quotes his Zapatistas, one world in which many worlds fit, while also laying out the stepping stones in creative and intentional work that suggests that perhaps this is not so difficult after all. We'd also like to thank the Korbel Latin America Center and Denver Justice and Peace Committee for their solidarity and support, and DJPC is also live streaming this event via their Facebook. CU Denver and Colorado College all help make possible the kinds of collaborations that brings speakers like Todd here to us this week. Thank you also to La Katrina Grill for the food that many of you are now eating over there. And thank you, Anna, for helping arrange that. They actually emerged from, many may know, as the Korbel Heritage Food Incubator, which supports immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs. A huge thank you also to the staff of CIPR, Anna and Zwi, my co-director, Lisa Martinez, as well as the students who work with the DU Immigrant and Refugee Rights Collectiva, Sam, Kayla, Abby, Rudy, Ida, hope I'm not forgetting anyone else, for making what we do possible, being so incredibly organized and responding to way too many of my emails. And again, as a reminder, DU has entered level blue COVID protocol, so please mask when you're not eating or drinking, and please try to leave space between yourself and others, and try to return to the same seat. Hopefully maybe at the end we'll have a little bit of time to mingle with Todd as well. And as one of the co-directors of CIPR, we're really excited for a lot of the collaborations that we have planned this year, including we're planning a big symposium around immigration issues in the spring, hope to bring in student work, speakers from the community, experts, and we'll also have as our keynote speaker, Cecilia Mendivar. So without further ado, we made you wait long enough. It's really my pleasure to have Todd Miller here back with us today.
Thank you. I might just say her. Right, that's perfect. Good. It's at the level. Thank you very much. Thanks for your wonderful introduction about that. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here again with you all. I really appreciate all the organizational efforts that have gone into this, which I know were pretty were vast. So thank you for everything. It's great to be here again. I do believe I was here 2 years ago. That seems like 2 decades ago, right? So pre-pandemic, barely pre-pandemic. We didn't know what was coming. So it's great to be back. And as Rebecca mentioned, I will be talking about this book, Build Bridges Not Walls. And I think the best way, by the way, this was published in April, so it's fairly recent, or very recent. And if you can see the cover, I'd like people to look at the cover, and you can see the cover. On the cover, there's a chain link fence back by the sea, and then the fence kind of changes shape in the middle. And I think this cover actually is my favorite cover of any book that I've read, because it really captures the spirit of what I'm trying to do with this book. But I will let you, I think the best way to talk about the book is just to begin with how it came to be. And so that's how I'll start. A couple years ago, I was on the Tohono Nation in southern Arizona. And I was with a elder of the Tohono. And the Tohono Nation is it's the second largest reservation in terms of size, geographical size. It's like behind the Navajo Nation. And it has a 70-mile border with Mexico. It's a very straight line, which, of course, the O'odham traditional lands go deep into Mexico. So the border itself on the Tohono Nation was imposed without any sort of consultation of the O'odham people. And so I was there with an elder named David Garcia, And we went to the Baba Kivari Peak. I don't know if people are familiar with southern Arizona, but Baba Kivari Peak it's a sacred mountain to the Atum. And we took a hike up to the top, and we're walking and walking. And I remember just as we were walking, just looking back, and as you look back, you see the huge sky, you see the Solaros and Ocotillo, and you see the mountain ranges going just deep into the horizon. And I remember stopping and thinking, I was just seeing a continuous landscape. I was most likely looking deep into Mexico, but I didn't know where Mexico started, right? The idea of a border was not present in that moment. And it was a very fleeting yet liberating moment. That a couple hours later, I was driving away from the peak, coming down the mountain, driving down a dirt road. And as I was driving, a man appeared at the side of the road. We were about 20 miles, 15 to 20 miles north of the US-Mexico border. And the man was waving his arms like this. And I stopped the car. He came up to the driver's side window, and I rolled it down. And he needed water, so I gave him some water. And then I asked him, what is there anything else I can do for you? And he asked me for a ride to the next town. And so it was that moment really where Built Bridges Not Walls, I think the book was born out of that moment. One, because in that moment I hesitated. I hesitated because I knew that if I were to give him a ride, I could get charged with smuggling, I could get charged with a felony and perhaps face years in prison for it. So I hesitated. And I hesitated also because I've been reporting on the border for so long. And I should mention at this point that this book, like Rebecca mentioned, is my fourth book, but it's a departure from my other three books, which are very straightforward investigative journalism. Like Border Patrol Nation really looks at the post 9/11 expansion of the U.S. border apparatus, the industry involved in it, among a number of other things. Storming the Wall was looking at getting a more global perspective, but looking at climate change. By the way, right now, if anybody's interested, I'll just interject this right here. I just co-authored a report called the Global Climate Wall, and it kind of crunches the numbers on looking at the countries with the highest emissions. We're correlating that countries with the highest historical emissions also are the countries with the largest border and immigration budgets. So if anybody wants a copy of that, it just came out purposely to as a UN summit is going on in Glasgow. So just an introduction. So they're storming the wall and Empire Borders, which I really followed a journalistic maxim of just following the money to follow U.S. border programs as they manifested all over the world, from the Mexico-Guatemala border to the Guatemala-Honduran border, to the Dominican-Haiti border, to the Jordan-Syrian border, to the Kenya-Tanzania border, to the Philippines. And so all that, well, at the moment with Juan Carlos, the man's name was Juan Carlos. We ended up talking more eventually. And he'd been walking in the desert for about 2 or 3 hours. I knew that there was probably a green striped vehicle patrolling nearby, Border Patrol. I knew that there were cameras capable of seeing us from 7 miles away or 7.5 miles away. I knew that there was drone systems that could fly 30,000 feet and see that we were there. I knew that there was implanted motion sensors everywhere that could set off an alarm if we tripped it. So I knew like what this whole security apparatus, this feeling of, if you talk to anyone on the Tohono Nation, people talk about this feeling of constantly being watched. And so I'm hesitating. And also I also very much know the history of what has gone on. I know like in 1994, deterrence strategy, prevention through deterrence, was implemented on the U.S.-Mexico border via Border Patrol Memorandum. The Border Patrol Memorandum was you put increased enforcement in the cities, in the urban areas, and the traditional places where people cross, and that would force people to circumvent those areas and go into places that were dangerous, if not deadly. In fact, they used the word in the memorandum that could put people in mortal danger. So the idea of that people would be risking their lives crossing the border is very much present in the design of the strategy. And since 1994, when this was implemented, the Border and Immigration Enforcement budget was $1.5 billion. And 2025, this year, just to give you an idea of how much this has increased, it's $25 billion. And this has steadily increased year after year after year. And with this not changing the deterrence strategy, and since then, at least by Border Patrol count, 8,000 remains of people have been found. Just about anyone you talk to, particularly the humanitarian aid organizations, like No More Deaths is a humanitarian aid organization. They came out with a report recently that said they thought it was 3 to 10 times more, based on the number of families looking for lost loved ones. So knowing this, and knowing that Juan Carlos had gone through the desert for 3 days, and knowing that, perhaps his life was in danger by staying there, that the hesitation brought this kind of clash, and actually anger, right? And there was an ire, and that ire was like, why on earth wouldn't I give Juan Carlos a ride, right? Like, basic values that I learned since I was a little kid says you help somebody in this sort of situation. I just give them a ride. Why would I not do that? Why? So all of a sudden I have this anger, the kind of, and it's really in that anger as well that the book came alive. And then there's one more thing. So based on those two things, and so I was mentioning all the kind of work I did, because it's like a reflection. I was like reflecting on almost 20 years of doing this reporting, and looking at the same time in this moment, and then at the same time, thinking about like how long I've been doing this and looking at this, and the kind of conversation around the border, how it generally stays in these very limited parameters. It seems like, following these conversations for so long, that the terminology sometimes changes, the way that people talk about it changes, but there's a certain limit. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about how it's discussed in the national sense, in the national discourse, in the media, and often in Congress. Like, we're gonna fix immigration, or we're gonna, it gets stuck in this kind of paradigm. And so what I did was I took this moment, I took this question of the paradigm, I took the question of the border, took questions like, can we possibly imagine something else than what we've got, right? Like, if we really looked into it, dissected it, and stood and looked and saw what it was doing. Like, can we allow ourselves to imagine something else? And so I brought that question to just a lot of people, including migrants and refugees, including activists and scholars, including politicians, including Border Patrol agents. And I hope to share a story from a Border Patrol agent here in a second. And children, children. I want to mention children because there's, I think it's important when thinking into the future generations, of course. And but one thing that my own 5-year-old told me, you know, as I was writing this book, and was, I thought, one of the best quotes in the book. He's actually 4, so he's even younger. But we were in San Diego, the border field park, kind of near where have people been? My glasses are fucking up. Anybody been to the border field park, like right on the border in San Diego? Yeah, so you saw the wall go out into the ocean, and the waves go right through the wall. So we were there. I was there with my family, and there was a border patrol agent perched on the hill, and there's these 2 surfers that kept antagonizing the agent. They were way out there, but they would go from Mexico to the United States. And the agent kept going, "Stop doing that." Or I forget what he said, but he was yelling at them. But then he eventually yelled at my 5-year-old, who was trying to run up to the border wall. Actually, it was a bollard. It's a bollard with the steel bars. You could see through it. We're gonna go. People were waving at us, so we're gonna go and talk to them. And the border patrol agent said the attention drifted from the surfers and to us. And so my 5-year-old was very upset about that. We sat on the sand and talked about it, and talked about the border, and he had just learned the word excavator. And of course, I said, "Why can't we take an excavator and crush the border wall?" So that was his first part of the sentence. And then the second part of the sentence, I think, was what really captures the spirit of the book. And then he said, "That turned the wall into bikes." So that ability to see something as it is, but then see the material of it, but then imagine it as something else. And brilliantly as bikes. It was like, you know, bikes being like a freedom of a symbol of freedom of movement. So to me, that really captured it. It's captured also like in the cover, this idea that fence turns into something else. And so yeah, so that was the kind of things. There's many like surprising stories that I learned about. I'd like to share one with you from a border patrol agent. One of the most surprising stories that I came across while interviewing an agent. But first, I wanted to say the book itself is again, it's a meditation on many years. It's not it's more of a book that tries to look at all these years and try to glean wisdom from those years, and then at the same time posing questions. It doesn't. I don't. It's not a book that has any sort of. Well, I don't know, but it doesn't. I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm just saying that the kind of it's trying to challenge the conversations about, you know, the border and how we think about it, and that sort of thing. And so I'm going to also return to that moment with Juan Carlos, because it turned into something more profound than what I was just mentioning. So I'm going to return to that story. But first, I want to share one of the most surprising stories that I heard while I was doing the research from the Border Patrol agent. Then I want to talk a little bit about some of the things, you know, ideas and concepts that came out of the book, and then return to Juan Carlos, if that sounds good, and then we'll have some discussion. So the Border Patrol agent story, I actually met this Border Patrol agent because I interviewed him for my first book, Border Patrol Nation. Border Patrol Nation was basically, for Border Patrol Nation, I was able to interview a lot of public information officers, but then all of a sudden, all these other agents volunteered to get interviewed off the side. So this is how I met this particular agent. So he was already, for an agent to do that, you know, it's already a moment where because they're supposed to go through a certain protocol, they're supposed to go through the public information officer, the public relations department. But anyhow, and to get right to the story, so the agent told me this story. His name is Brendan Lenahan. He told me this story that he was patrolling in Arivaca. He gets he gets a call from dispatch, and the dispatch tells him that somebody tripped a motion sensor and up a mountain near Harkavaka. So he went up this like narrow road up to the top to an empty mine shaft, and he looked down and he saw footprints. So like most border patrol agents, he got out of his vehicle and began to plan to follow the footprints. At that moment, a man appeared out of a ravine in front of him. And it was obvious that the man was in distress. He was waving his arms. Lenihan, one of the things that he told me, he said, in that case, I normally would have arrested, because that's what border patrol, asked him for his papers and arrested him. But for some reason, he said I didn't do that. He understood that a family member was in distress, and he followed the man down into the ravine. Of course, he didn't entirely trust the man because he put on his assault rifle, right? But he did follow the man down into the ravine, and at the bottom of the ravine, what turned out to be the younger brother of the man was laying. His head was in the hands of his cousin, who was rocking him back and forth like you would a baby almost. So when he opened his eyes, all he could see was the whites in his eyes. And so Lenihan knew that the younger brother was in distress, and he called dispatch and asked for a helicopter. The helicopter, of course, couldn't get down into a ravine, so he then they decided to bring the younger brother out of the ravine, and they did this by forming like a human stretcher between the Lenihan and the brother, like locked arms, and then at their elbows, and then the cousin held the younger brother's head. And so they walked up the ravine. It was very hot. It was September, and the sun was burning down, and they started to sweat. And he also described the assault rifle, which is another. It was like coming against his neck, and his hands started to slip until there was a moment when the older brother and Lenihan's hands came clasped together, so they were holding hands. And the way that Lenihan describes it in the interview said that moment became strangely intimate. He thought in the interview, I don't know if he thought this at the time, but he said in the interview said somebody that I would normally be arresting, all of a sudden I'm holding hands with that person and holding them like that. And then he even then something happened where he lost sense of who he was. And he looked down at the younger brother, and according to what he says, I thought the younger brother was my own brother. And this moment lasted for a while until his radio crackled, and then he remembered he was a border patrol agent. And then I go more into the story in the book, but they get him up to the ravine, and a long story short, he realizes later that the brother died. The younger brother died probably as they were going up the ravine. He started to show signs of it. And now the agent Lenihan is no longer a border patrol agent, but and I imagine this he doesn't say it explicitly, but I imagine this was one of these moments that really shifted for him. But the way he explained what happened afterwards, he went to commiserate with his fellow agents at a bar, and he said that they were all trying to make him feel better, but they said, don't worry, this is all part of the border game. So the idea of the game, the idea, again, going back to prevention, the idea of the policy of prevention through deterrence, the idea that people are just dying, a lot of people are dying in the desert, that every agent knows this, every agent sees this up close. And you have to make it just a part of the border game, right? But in this moment, he wasn't, that was not a satisfactory answer, for him. And so I guess he got the next day off, and his supervisor called him and said, "Don't worry, they were drug smugglers." And then this is an interesting part of the interview with him, because when he said that, when he describes it, he looked at me. I don't think he said this to his supervisor. He said, "What did I care? What did I care if they were drug smugglers?" In fact, I want to read just one thing that he said from the book. So he said, "To me, it doesn't make a difference. They just seem like regular guys." This is a border patrol. "They just seem like regular guys, and who knows what kind of job I would have had if I grew up in their situation in life. It could have been me." And then he said, the next thing that happened was just a little bit after his supervisor came, like marijuana, which is now, of course, legal in Arizona, but at the time was not, wafted into his apartment. So he thought, there I am, I had this strange experience, traumatic experience, trying to go stop them and help them. And now my neighbor is smoking the very thing I'm trying to stop. And then he says, there is an element of absurdity to it all. So the idea of the border being completely absurd was very prevalent in even in a border patrol agent, right? And of course, you could look at all the different things, like he pointed out the drug. We could talk about, like, in the book, I actually cite a lot of studies about, different things, like as far as drugs coming across the border, how most of them come across through the ports of entry, that talk about the demand in the United States, or a number of other different things, such as like different justifications for the border and immigration apparatus, such as crime and economics and all this other stuff. There's all kinds of studies that I cite in the book that really debunk all those sorts of arguments. So I encourage you to look at that. But I wanted to stress one particular thing that he was saying. He was saying that he understood in his own way, right, as a border patrol, but he was saying that he understood what the border meant in terms of stratification, in terms of creating inequality between places. And I would take it even further, that the border itself, and I would say the US-Mexico border, but also the scaffolding of borders around the world globally, the border itself, the way that it's designed, the way that it's meant, how it's for those who are concerned with the world of justice, the border itself is an impediment to that. And so with that, I want to go back to So when my 5-year-old said, "Oh, looking at the wall and turning it into bikes," he expanded past that later. It's like, why can't I take the wall and turn it into railroad tracks? Why can't I take the wall and turn it into houses? And I thought, like, one of the things in this book, and I often think this is a very practical way, or a possibly practical way to talk about this, is what about that sort of lens of imagining something new by looking at the very budgets, like looking at the budgets that exist, like that $1.5 billion to $25 billion we have of the CDP and ICE combined budget for 2021, and how, like, the amount of money that's spent on CBP and ICE since since the Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003, was about close to $350 billion. And it seems to me, when you look at those sorts of budgets, which manifest in all the ways that we're talking about, more agents, like 4,000 border patrol agents to 21,000, billions of dollars in technologies, more than 700 miles of walls and barriers along the 2,000-mile US-Mexico border, but also increased enforcement up on the Canadian border. And a whole other part of it that nobody really, that at least the media doesn't talk about, is the Caribbean front and the kind of focus that we've seen in the Caribbean as well, not to mention the externalization into other places and the extension of it. And you think, and so that $25 billion only it's just CBP and ICE, it doesn't even encompass, like, it's actually much bigger than that. But when you look at that budget, isn't it possible to think that that money might be better spent? Like if you look at security, like what is human security? What is well-being? What would be well-being for people? Like border security is one of those words that seems sacrosanct, right? Do not question border security. If you say anything against border security, well, what are you talking about? You're against security? That you can't be against security. What do you're against protection, right? It's a terminology trap. You get stuck in this trap, and when you start to like unpack it, you see, well, is it really about security? Because the deterrence strategy is really about insecurity, right? It's about making people as unsafe as possible, even facing death, right? So that's not security. Or is it security for people that live in the borderlands? I would go talk to anyone that lives in the border, like in Arizona borderlands, and go talk to people in the Tohono Nation who you have to go through a checkpoint and any paved road going out of the reservation, or talk to people in many different people do not talk about feeling secure, they talk about feeling insecure. So this idea of security is inaccurate. And I think that's the key to that. Like, okay, what is security? What would be security? You can even look at it in domestic. Like, oh yeah, if people are drinking poisoned water or leaded water in places like Flint, Michigan, for example, or dozens of other communities, isn't that a security issue, right? Shouldn't clean water be a priority? Or affordable housing, this seems to be an obvious one because a roof over somebody's head seems to be a big security, like having a place to sleep at night. And when you see that affordable housing's been cut over and over again. Or I want to mention this climate report that we just did, because we looked at, so in terms of climate change, you have all the data showing that there's increased displacement due to climate. Projections show that, like the World Bank just put out this report estimating that there's going to be nearly 216 million people displaced in 6 different regions by 2050, and that's one report. There's another report that came out that estimated 1.2 billion people. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which is one of the most reliable sources that looks at displacement, is showing that about 25 million people per year are already being displaced, and that's an undercount according to their own data, because they say themselves they can't count droughts well enough. They only count drought in 4 different countries, and if about Central America is being pounded with recurring droughts, and so the sort of climate crisis is just mounting and mounting. Like the statistics for 2020 in just Honduras and Guatemala were 1.3 million people displaced due to disasters, mostly to these massive hurricanes that came compounded with the droughts. And we're talking about major displacement. There's caravans of people that have come from Honduras that have cited these reasons, being flooded out of their homes, as one of the primary reasons for coming north in the beginning of 2021. So all that said, these sorts of realities, and then as I mentioned, we're crunching the numbers, looking at the highest emitting countries. Who's the highest emitting country historically?
United States.
Exactly. Yeah, United States, 30.1% historical emissions, but also correlating with the biggest border and immigration budgets, right, of all countries. The U.S. is number one. But we looked at all these countries in the top 10 historic emitters and looked at their across the board. All of them had high border and immigration enforcement budgets. And then we compared it against climate finance. Climate finance is money that countries, actually the richest countries, committed to giving $100 billion to the most vulnerable countries in 2020. It was collective giving them $100 billion, which, and I can send a report to people. Looking at the climate finance, it was woeful. It was neglected, to say the least. It over-reported, and there's a number of problems with it, and never reached $100 billion. And the countries around the world, as far as climate finance, is basically money given to other countries to help them with climate adaptation. $100 billion is even a fraction of what is needed, given what's going on. So again, if you look at the budgets, so one of the things we suggested in the report was why this money went to the border. Like the U.S. is 11-to-1 ratio from border and immigration enforcement to climate finance. Why can't that money shift into what has already been committed to, right? Is inadequate. So I'm just giving you some examples of how, like, to think of it in those terms, like moving the money away from one thing and putting it into another. And this kind of followed, and I'm gonna end here soon, have a long discussion. But this follows one of the things I look at as well, and I did look at some abolitionist thinking, especially for prison abolitionists, abolition movements that have been going on for decades. And one person in particular, Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, who's a geographer, very insightful. I recommend. I'm sure some people here know of Ruthie, but I would suggest looking into her work. And one of the things that she says about prisons is that, well, 1%, when she talks about abolition, 1% is about destroying a prison, but 99% is about creating a world of justice that eliminates the prison, right? So if you apply that to the border and immigration apparatus and the incarceration part of it as well, isn't there, like when you look at the border is put there and justified for things. When you hear border crisis, I would well, is it really? Or is it a displacement crisis that we call border? Can a border ever be a crisis? Like the border is an inanimate object, right? It's like people are in crisis. And so it's more accurate to be called a displacement crisis. And the displacement crisis is happening thousands of miles away from the border, but here's the border, right? And so this is kind of shifting. What is this world of justice, right? What is this world of justice that we're looking for? And which brings me back to that moment with Juan Carlos. What is that justice like? And I say this on hindsight because in the moment, of course, we were thinking quickly, and I had to decide whether I was going to give him a ride or not. And I really can't tell you if I did or not, but I'll just let you know that what you suspect that I did is probably true. But I realized, for this world of justice that Gilmore talks about, entailed me asking, talking to Juan Carlos and asking, why were you walking for 2 to 3 days in the desert? Why did you leave your home from your community, Guatemala? What were the different factors that had made that happen to begin with? Was there anything from my own country, policies coming from my own country, that were influencing that at all? Were you a farmer that your crops wilted in a drought? Were you in a place where the extractive industry came in and just tore your community apart, poisoned your water? Was there some sort of historic thing that happened, after the CIA instigated coup in 1954, right? To talk to Juan Carlos, or to talk to to begin this like cross-border dialogue where we're understanding, we're talking to each other. If there's to listen to him or thousands of other people that we're coming across, or the movements in places around the world, like in Guatemala, that are saying precisely exactly what they need for the world of justice. It's like looking at that. Isn't that where a lot of the answers lie? And so it was in that moment, in the hindsight, really, that it seems like I'm the one being benevolent, right? Possibly giving him a ride. And but really, I was the one that needed to be oriented. I was the one that needed to learn about what a world of justice is. And I think that world of justice comes from that solidarity that's across borders, that's across peoples. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. And we can have questions and conversations.
If you can stand up when you ask the question and just briefly introduce yourself.
Do you want to use the mic?
Sure, maybe we should pass the mic.
I don't know, just thought
I can do that. Would anyone like to ask Todd a question? Yes, and then please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm also in the migration class with Professor Balamba here. I want to go back to the money part of it, and especially when you mentioned justice. So, especially right now, how we've seen a lot of Haitians that have been coming to the southern border. Back when that major earthquake happened, Haiti was historically one of the countries that received so much aid money. Years went by and another earthquake and more environmental crisis causes more people to leave. So I'm a bit skeptical of how we put money to this issue because this is a question, I'm not just saying it. How are you looking at money being used to get to the issue? Because you mentioned how billions of money is going to state patrol or border patrol, but how is that money, in your opinion, should be used to get to the bottom of this issue? Because just billions of dollars every year are used for aid purposes, and migration continues to flourish. So how are you putting those two together?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Which is a great question. It's a really fundamental one, and it makes me hesitate even to bring up the one thing I want to stress is that this money towards this border and immigration, if you shift it away, it could be used for something else. Which on one hand takes money out of the border and immigration apparatus. So there's a twofold thing, right? But going to aid and how aid has traditionally been dispersed, and the USAID, for example, I don't know enough about it, but I know that I've read and seen and know a little bit about its history, which has somewhat of a notorious history. And so like climate finance, if you're talking about climate finance, it's already like when you start looking at it, and there's all these reports that come out from like different organizations like Oxfam International is already looking at how it's been misreported, how it's there's a claim that like all this aid is going to this when it really it's these broader projects, and sometimes even there's a coal plant project that was a better coal plant than another coal plant, and they were saying, oh, this is mitigation for climate, right? So there's like all this stuff that you see that just pops out from that, where aid is then what should be grants or loans, there's just tons of stuff. And so what I think of is that it has to be like whatever this climate, when you talk about climate finance or probably any aid at all, should really just be given to like, communities at a community level. And it should be community, like as democratically and community generated as possible, because the different localities are what know what they need. It's not the outside world or its imposition, often very arrogant imposition of like, oh, you need this, right? And I think that happens a lot. For that to happen, I don't know. I mean, the bigger point was just making like, can't this money be used in a better way? However, yeah, what you discussed are the intricacies of how, even if that shifted, that money could just be misused. It could be abused. It could be like, there could be a number of different things. So there would have to be some sort of framework and way to like how they distribute that money in a certain way. I would think, probably be through some fund that I have no idea, but I think you raise a really good point.
And Haiti's a really quintessential case study of basically aid being given in ways that don't actually trust the people who need it to
Yeah, right.
use. I mean, a tiny sliver went to actual Haitian organizations and governments, and much of the kind of U.S. aid apparatus, much of the money actually came right back to the United States. It was a tied aid agreement. So it's actually a really quintessential case of not necessarily being wasted or not spent, but about the culture and structure of the humanitarian aid industry and how it operates. Are there any questions? Here, let me bring that over here.
I'm Sudev. I am the International Students Committee Chair for the undergraduate student government here, and I also work for the city's public health department. And I am working with a group of students who are trying to establish a community outreach center for immigrants here in Denver. I have two questions. First, I want to continue the conversation on aid that we just have going on right now. I'm in Dr. Maureen Taylor's class about immigration, and something we've talked about in this class is how it might be beneficial to shift the way we look at and talk about aid from monetary aid to kind of how do I put this? A like more material aid in the way of like, instead of sending money, you have teachers or doctors or community service people like go in there and help build the community from ground up. Based on your experience, do you think that's a more efficient way of helping at-risk communities in these countries, or what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it sounds better than what it currently is, that's for sure. I mean, I think any sort of aid that ends up in really community hands, I guess, material, whether it be, material aid would be great, but even monetary aid in the community's hands. I think it's more of like being directed from a kind of grassroots organizations that are a little more local. I think that's what I would think, without having that's definitely, I haven't given enough thought to that to give you a really nice, thoughtful answer.
My other question was about the idea of justice that you talked about, and we briefly touched on this this morning during brunch as well. Well, you talked about how countries that have the highest carbon emissions are also the countries with the most militarized border wall. But something I was thinking about while you were talking is that the countries that have the most militarized border wall are also the countries that have played the most role in possibly destabilizing the home countries of a bunch of these migrants. And there is an intrinsic direct link between the migration crisis and the prison industrial complex that generates a lot of wealth for these countries, in the same way that destabilizing these countries through coups also generate a lot of wealth for these countries. Do you think it's part of a larger pattern?
Yes.
And what could we as individuals probably do?
I honestly think an idea of, from at least my perspective, I think in terms of solidarity, I really think your analysis is spot on there. I was just talking about climate change and the highest emitting countries, of course, are the most responsible. if you're gonna take the cumulative amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. But that's only one part of it. Like you just see this, you know, long history, right? From colonial times to present, from colonial times to neo-colonial times to today, right? Of just certain countries and certain places going and just ransacking other countries, taking their wealth, exploiting people, and that to me, you know, that's one of the things that I thought about with this in this book too. Like, why when we're talking about open borders, why when that subject's brought up, why is it always, you know, the people arriving to our border, right? Somebody who's been displaced or dispossessed or whatever reason, and never think that there's an open border policy already in place. And that open border policy is for that, exactly that. Like, if you look at NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA, it's on an open borders policy for corporations. They can just cross the border, they can go at 35,000 feet, there's no border patrol stopping them. There's no, like, if a mine sets up shop someplace and poisons communities' waters, like which often happens, there's no ice that goes in and rounds up the mine, deports them. Like when you're talking about border enforcement, always the people that have been displaced by those very processes. And so I mean, your question led me to think of that. And I mean, to think of it, I don't know, like, but I think what you say, that makes me, in understanding that, and as somebody from the US, of course, understanding that as a US citizen, even looking at my own country, as I was like just talking about, you can look at any place, but Guatemala is a good place to look at, for example, or with the history of intervention there, and the history of corporations going there, with the United Fruit Company was behind in 1954 too, and so on and so forth, you know, and the military dictatorships and the trainings of the soldiers and the generals, you know, there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of stuff that goes into why a person becomes displaced or leaves or ends up walking through the desert. And in a world of justice, right, we're talking straightforwardly about all this stuff. We're talking about, you know, looking at those things, talking about those different, and looking at through the frame of justice. That's why.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Riley, and I am a student of public policy and political science with minors in international studies, Spanish, and leadership. I have a question regarding your conversations you had for the book. So based on your conversations with policymakers and other experts, what was the most practical policy solution you found in terms of a more justice-oriented immigration policy and border policy? Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually in this book, I did avoid the kind of policy prescriptions. Not that I don't think that's a great idea. I was just trying to take it in another direction, because I know that there are interesting policy proposals out there. One of the things that I was trying to challenge too was the kind of rut I think the policy proposals get into. Like when you talk about, like for example, the last time comprehensive immigration reform bill was passed, and it was passed through the Senate in 2013. And it was a bipartisan, you know, bill, and I think it was a gang of 8, right? It was a gang of 8 senators. And if you look at that bill, which was 1,000 pages long, and it had a legalization. So this is where the debate, you know, there's a legalization mechanism. That's, you know, that's not for everyone, but there would be a criteria, but that was in place in that. There was stuff about DACA, you know. But also there was like $45 billion given to the border and the immigration. And like, and there was a call for 20,000 more border patrol agents. There was a call to double Operation Streamline. Operation Streamline was this zero tolerance operation that if you cross the border, you'll face a judge. And before the pandemic, before the Title 42 stuff you see right now, they were taking in like 75 people a day, so it would go up to 210 people a day, just Tucson, the Tucson sector. So it has all this other, you know what I mean? It seems like the policy debates get stuck in this. Like, you give me this, I give you that. I mean, that doesn't mean that there could be, you know, something that, I think that paradigm that it's stuck in needs to be challenged.
Yeah.
I think occasionally you'll see that being challenged, you know, in different ways. Like, one thing I found interesting that really got up into the echelons, of higher echelons, was remember the abolish ICE? It was very interesting because it caught on, and they used the word abolish, which I was like, wow, you know, and it caught on and got mainstream. And there was some people in the Democratic Party, certain sector of them, that was actually talking about that. To me, that's what's kind of interesting, right? Because what if, like, it's going to be kind of, I guess I hate to use the word because of isn't it too right? But if it gets in a lexicon, it gets in the debate, and it bubbles up into some people's mouths, and people are talking about it, who knows what that leads to, right? Who knows what the arc of that is? So I write about that as well too. I mean, yeah, but I don't have any policy, I mean, I didn't look for policy prescriptions.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, because I think definitely as someone who studies this and is interested in this issue, it can be extremely frustrating because when you're looking at policies and implementing solutions on the ground and what the actual cultural shift that's required, it's frustrating when you find all these hurdles to that. So how do you kind of stay optimistic and stay encouraged when involved in this issue, when it can be, there's just, like most policy issues, it's a very slow, long process.
Yeah.
And there isn't that change that can just be easily implemented.
Yeah, I think I find my inspiration from, the policy part of it does get so frustrating, right? It seems to tread in the same waters constantly. It doesn't, like, you cannot even, like, try going out and mentioning open borders, right? Forget it, right? You're either gonna get ridiculed if it's somebody from one side, or it's be told it's impractical. I think, I think that my inspiration really, I think that things can be done. I don't want to be like totally, I think like things can be done at policy levels, but I think the response that happens, how policy moves, is through pressure, and pressure comes from below. And it's from below where I get my inspiration. It's like the organizing, the people doing things. I even like tear up if I just see somebody being nice to each other, another person, you know what I mean? It's just like those sorts of things that come at very individual levels or group levels or movements, and I'm not even talking about in the United States, like the policy prescription just gets stuck in this like domestic thing. Like, it's not domestic. It's like, if you get stuck in the domestic thing, then all the stuff we were just talking about, like all of US foreign policies that are just causing devastation, we haven't even talked about war, right? Devastation in other places, or or the least impact why people are being displaced in the first place, never ever gets mentioned, right? And so those sorts of like on the ground organizing, that you see here in Denver, of course, but also the cross pollination that extends it has a global scope to it. That's where I find inspiration, because it's those global conversations. And then what I look for is hopefully that in an upper echelon policy way, I hope it bubbles up and hopefully maybe has impact. But I know there's other people that like that, okay, we're gonna go hit Capitol Hill. We're gonna go meet with all these people, and I think that's awesome, right? And I think that's a part of it too, and that's great. And I think it's like one of those things you just have to keep hitting at all kinds of different angles and levels. But if you're looking up at like the Biden administration for hope, forget it, you know, right? It's like, it's just like, yeah, maybe they will be, maybe in a year when all of a sudden we're just like, yeah, no, you know, like we gotta do something. Yeah.
Yep. Oh,
You want to get it?
I can get it.
Okay.
So kind of building off of what you were just talking about, I have two questions for you. One of them is, how do I want to word it? I guess, what are some examples of like effective or inspiring, like grassroots efforts that are kind of chipping away at the system in some way? Maybe that is like in a subversive way. And then my second question is, will you expand a little bit more on, I guess, what you learned from reading and learning from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore?
Sure. Yeah, I think those questions go hand in hand, like what Gilmore talks about presence, right? If you listen to her talk, so it's like presence, like being present with the moment. And she understands like the economic model, which she calls organized abandonment, right? So organized abandonment, like that's another way of describing kind of the neoliberal economic model of cutting like things that would help people, you know, bolstering the security state really. And so she talks a lot about that. And when she talks about what that entails, it's all about, you know, the little and the big things that people could do. I think she talks about reforms and what are reforms, and there's reforms, probably like the immigration reform bill I just mentioned, that just keep the whole thing in place. And there's non-reformist reforms. So non-reformist reforms are those reforms that are like steps that you take, but has a longer arc of justice, right? Like in the app, like if you're gonna abolish the border, you can't go to Washington right now and go, hey, we're gonna abolish the border, you know, you'll be laughed out of town. But like I think what Gilmore would say would be like, well, she does say it. She said, start living as if the border doesn't exist. So what does that mean if you start living as if the border doesn't exist? And then what are what are big steps? What are little steps? What are small steps? What are the steps, you know? And that doesn't legitimize it, but it could be just like going and joining an organization in Denver, right? Or going to a detention center, or I don't know like what it is. I think it's going to be different for every single person. And then how does that articulate into a movement? One of the movements that I write about in the book is actually the Zapatista movement, which to me is really emblematic of a lot of things. And that's when I was younger, I spent some time down there and going to places, and I just started, when I was writing this book, I really started thinking about those moments, what I learned from the people, and you know, how, you know, when the Zapatistas any movement anywhere articulate something, like they're talking about the very needs of the people like right in those regions. Like one of the thoughts that kept crossing my head as I was like, oh, if you come across an anti-immigrant person, like that would say this, you know, you said, oh, you should be on the Zapatistas, because Zapatistas are saying exactly what people need, and Chiapa. I would probably never say that, but you know what I mean? Like, that's, you know, you should be a Zapatista. I mean, you wouldn't be a Zapatista.
I know you mean.
You know what I mean? I don't want to be misunderstood here. But the thing about it is, like, those articulations of what justice is, you know, are all over the place. Everyone has it. Go across the world. And there's people saying, this is what we need, you know, here, this is what we need to do, this is what has to happen. And to be able to listen to that, and that's one of the things, like when you look at the history of colonialism, it's not listening, it's imposing, right? It's imposing violently often. Like you look at how borders are imposed, there's almost every border you'll see was imposed in a violent fashion. And it's imposed violently, and then it's legitimized. There's a whole theory around this. It's like the policy of, I can't remember what it is, but there's a whole like theory. There's a violent imposition of a border, and then you forget about it. You forget about the violence that brought the border to begin with, and then it legitimizes the border, right? So, I don't know. I hope I answered somewhat.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it. Anyone else? Oh.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I work for CIPR. I don't really know my job title, but I'm the person that sends you all emails. My question for you is like a little bit more abstract, and it comes from a place of like in 2018 when all the ICE protests were happening in Colorado. Like I remember going to them when I was a teenager and being like, oh my God, there's like 40 people here. This is amazing. This is activism. I'm feeling super awesome about it. And then like fast forward however many years to the BLM protests, and I'm like, wow, activism is like a real thing. There's 200 people here, yada, yada, yada. And then most recently, I just went to a candlelight vigil for all the migratory agricultural people that died during COVID. And I was one of 7 people. And that absolutely broke my heart. And I don't really know, I guess my question for you is how to make people, or maybe the semantics to make people care about border issues, because I'm finding that like so many people just don't know anything about border issues. And when you try to explain them, it either becomes too political or too abstract to grasp. And I think like some of that is because people aren't seeing dead bodies. Like it's not like a very public display of violence in certain ways, because people are dying and they disappear and they're not brought up again. But I guess my question is like how to approach that issue, the issue of border violence and topics like that in a way that makes people actually care and grasp what's going on. And that's like, I mean, it's a big question, but if you had any advice for that.
Yeah, I always think of, you know, the 2018, I think we mentioned this at lunch too, the 2018 family separation, and when like the cameras were on agents like pulling children away from their parents. And then the cameras were on like 1-year-olds facing an immigration judge. And when people start seeing the border, obviously this is a very Trump moment, and the Trump administration has taken that to, you know, the cruelty of it to its extremes, and also flaunting it, wanting the cameras on it, right? But to see that, like, the sort of reaction, the public response to that, right? And when you know, like looking at border issues for so long and always seeing the cameras pointed the other way. And I think purposely it's designed to be that way. The deterrence strategy forces people out into places where the cameras are not, right? The violence often happens way away from anything, way away from any witness. And then when you think of the extension of the border, which is a lot of what I focus on as well, which I haven't talked about as much, like just going to the Mexico-Guatemala border, which of course Rebecca is the next one. You know, if they're not in the desert in Arizona, they're very much not in on the Mexico-Guatemala border, right, where all kinds of things are happening. And so with a lack of that sort of lack of awareness, you know. But to contrast when in the 2018 the sort of galvanization of people when they were seeing this stuff happening before their eyes and just seeing the kind of brutality of what the border is, right? For a moment, people did not like it, right? There was a whole thing. So I keep thinking back to that moment. I'm really sad that the cameras turn away after that. I'm really like the people that die every year in the desert. That's very predictable, and it's going to happen. It happens every year in the same cycle. People who are healthy now are going to die this coming summer again, right? Because the policy is still in place. That the national media has just completely ignored. It just does not cover that. It does not cover what people in Arizona or like people in the borderlands call a humanitarian crisis, right? Dead bodies are in the desert, and it's the policy is designed that way to make it so. It was interesting to me, when Trump was campaigning in 2016 about building a wall. So the national media was like, oh, the wall, he's gonna build a wall. And never once did they mention that there was already like a wall, right? I know Trump was talking about building a bigger wall, but he acted like in his campaign that there was no wall, right? And then all of a sudden I remember the media discovered, more of the national media, right? Oh, there's a wall. And then they would get these digital stories. Oh, the wall's here. But this whole area is completely no wall. And then in that story, they do not mention the strategy, prevention through deterrence, it purposely keeps those areas open. Because the wall is that, so it's like the way that it's being reported is just completely, like how can you look at that really high-tech digital story and really have any understanding of what's going on? You don't, right? You just look, oh, there's no wall there. Oh my gosh, it's an open border. And then that it spins off into its own thing. So I think, that whole thing of awareness about what's going on, I know that's not everything, but it's amazing, like having like traveled around the country for now many years and talked about this stuff with different people. And it is amazing like how much that isn't known about what's there. And that like the idea that these budgets have increased, that's not very well known, or the deterrent strategy was not known. There's so many things about it that's not known. Not to say that if everyone knew it, but I think if everyone knew it and saw more of what this meant and what this did, there might be a different conversation.
And I guess a follow-up question to that is like, when you're thinking about raising awareness and like eliciting empathy for people, like there's a very human process that occurs when a person like recognizes somebody else as a human, and there's like that connection piece. And I think what's so hard for me in my head is like to raise awareness, like you want to get loud about issues and you want to speak up, but like when you get loud about immigration issues, people get deported. Like this is their lives, they're here. And so this whole like this human connection piece that comes from me seeing another person like is kind of lost because there's such a vulnerable population. And so it's like then do we just speak of people like not connected to their human lives in America because it's somewhat like I don't know, like my question is like how do you talk about like personal stories with people like knowing that like that is their very livelihood and like that's something you can't really mess with, but also how do you make that human without that individualization?
Yeah, that's the thing I come across. Like as a journalist, right? So I'm a journalist, and my type of journalism is so often telling, like going and talking to people and hearing their stories and then writing about their stories. So the way I go about it, and I only can speak from my own way as a journalist, is you go into these process really respectful. There's like make sure the person wants to tell their story, of course, and then be like, do you want me to use this? Like, I'll use pseudonyms, and I'm not even talking about people totally. Like, I also, through my years of doing this, I have border patrol agents who come up to me off to the side, who will talk to me, but they don't want me to use their name, right? So like giving pseudonyms, I mean, that's almost always something that I protect the person, and sometimes even changing details and that sort of thing, and then focusing on the story of the person. And it depends on the person, because some people do want their story to be told, They want their names attached to it. So I respect that as well, if that's what they want. But that's how I go about it as a journalist. It's a tricky process though. Like I definitely heard what you're saying. It gets very tricky. It's very contextual and it depends on the person. And then to me, it comes down to just treating everyone with dignity and respect and respecting how they want to go about things.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Rebecca Zuniga, the director of the Denver Justice and Peace Committee. Thank you, Todd, for being here today with us.
Great to see you.
And I think what I want to bring to the attention of people is what you've been saying, is the importance of the human being. And that's the way we're going to show our solidarity, by telling the stories of what we see. And I mean, yes, we would love the borders not to exist. They do exist because of our policies, because of border imperialism. And it is through these conversations that we're going to make a change. There are movements there. You bring the story from the border, right? You live right there. You see this policies in place. That my call would be to act on them. There's several things happening right now as we speak. We're calling for citizenship for all, no matter who you are. So there are things we can do to change those policies for those of you that are interested in changing what is done in Washington, D.C. But also, we can be active here in the community through participating in those vigils. There are vigils in front of the detention center to ask those detention centers in Aurora to be closed. We don't want them anymore. So there are actions that we can do in the day-to-day life that will change those policies. But I would like you to go more than thinking about the policies. Like, how do you change people's minds? How do you get involved in your community and your little network and do that? And obviously, the pandemic has changed the way we do solidarity nowadays. So if you can't be in a large gathering, you can be in a smaller gathering. You can find your youth. You have so many creative ways of engaging with people and bringing conversation that I would invite you to continue doing those. And also, I'm here as the Denver Justice and Peace Committee. We also try to facilitate those conversations. Lately, we've been doing them on Zoom, and because we want to be safe for everyone. When it's possible, we'll do them in person again. And also, we have delegations to Chiapas, for example, that we hope to have again in the not so far future. So I just invite you to think about those options and think about how do you show your solidarity, how the immigrant community is all of us. We're all immigrants at the end. So we recognize that we stand in native lands of the youth of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. So let's remember that every time we're here, we're talking to each other and trying to make change with a human heart.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you're interested also in joining the list of DJBC, can either seek Rebecca out or also Dr. Holland, who many of you probably already know, who's in the back, and we can definitely facilitate that. But that's why we love having joint events together, as it really brings, I think, the academic plus the activists plus the community together. Ready? Oh, go ahead. We'll do 2 more questions.
I have somewhat of an addendum to both like Zui's question and the call to action we just had. My question is about like the stigma surrounding conversations about immigration. Like when we try to amplify or advocate or have this conversation. Like I know from my own, like talking about my own experience as an immigrant and my experience with grassroots level protesting, or just my experience with detention centers that I briefly talked about this morning, my experience with immigration, customs and border patrol and stuff like that. A lot of the time, the reaction you get is couched in this layers of stigma. People either don't want to talk about it, because they're afraid, or because, they don't know what they can do, or they're like, oh yeah, wouldn't you like to open the floodgates? Like, depending on who you're talking to. So how do you kind of break through that stigma and normalize conversation?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It just depends. It depends. Like I write about the border a lot, so I do end up in conversations quite a bit. What I do, like what I've done and what I continue to do, and is I have a kind of self policy of like I'll talk to anyone. I'll even get on. I get invited on right wing radio shows from time to time. I'll always go on them. Sometimes the host just wants to ridicule me, but whatever. Sometimes there's good faith conversations too, trying to understand too. So I don't just want to I'm kind of tired of the partisan stuff, and I think breaking through that is important for me at least. So I'll go to the one, there's one, I forget what it was, and every once in a while I'll make a statement for this thing called the Institute for Public Accuracy, and I'll put out a press release, and then you get a lot of radio interviews, and I usually do every single one that comes my way. And I remember one, the host told me immediately, she said, you said this, I can't remember what I said. Sorry, but I said something that she said, you said this, and I got you on because pretty much she said, I'm going to ridicule you, and she did, she tried, and so what I did was I just changed my tactic right there. So what I do often is just change to the moment, and in that moment, I decided, and this is how I've treated this in other cases too. I just decided I'm not gonna react to the antagonism. I'm going to just speak calmly and factually about it. And she kept trying, but I just kept. And I don't know if that had any sort of effect, but I was not thinking of her. I was thinking of the listeners. And then there was another time I was on another show, and this time the host was more exuberant, but it was very pro-Trump. I think it was 2016 or 2000. It was around that time. It's what do you think of that wall that he's going to build in Nogales? And so I just slowed down and went through really methodically, slowly, of how the wall was already built in Nogales, and just went through the whole strategy, just step by step, using years. And then in his case, he was a little bit more open-minded than the first person. Oh, okay. I don't know. The point is that I try to. There's cases where it just everyone has, or at least I do. I have an aunt, I remember with this book, I posted the cover on it, and she wrote me in my Facebook. She's like, congratulations, I will not be reading it. So with her, it's just what's the point? My parents were going to argue with her and stuff, but I just she's fine, and Gail, have fun, Yeah, so I don't know. It's just different contexts with different people. But I always I think what Rebecca was bringing up earlier, that bringing the stories, and the stories are really super important. I think, especially stories that illustrate simultaneously the policy and illustrate what people are going through. And the whole thing about the policy is so dehumanizing. So telling stories, I think, is really important to really counteract that part of it as well. So those are some things that I use.
Thank you.
You pointed out earlier the absurdities as well.
Yeah, the absurdities, exactly.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Alicia Barron Lopez, and I'm a teaching professor at the Department of Spanish Language, Literary, and Cultural Studies. And I agree totally that it's very important to tell the human stories of these people experiencing these hardships. And I also think that it's very important to unveil other aspects that lie behind the stigma of what people can and usually talk about and what they cannot and they don't usually talk about. And I think I appreciate something in your books that is how you unveil and dismantle the whole border industry that includes all the surveillance systems and the incarceration business that is going on. And that aspect, I don't think people talk enough about. And I was wondering if you feel that that is something that could contribute to changing the policies and changing the way people think here within the United States in terms of being really pissed in how the budget is used. Who do you think are the most effective institutions or voices that are leading into that direction of questioning all this border business?
Yeah, thank you for raising that point, really. It's amazing to me that every time we talk about immigration reform, and you talk about the actors in immigration reform, that industry is not never mentioned, and the industry is growing as the budgets grow, right? It's getting bigger and bigger, and even I'm surprised by the numbers, looking from 2008 to 2020 that there was 105,000 contracts given by CPP and ICE worth $55 billion, and there's top contractors and there's certain companies that get more contracts and there's current companies vying for contracts. And those companies also have the inside thing in Washington, right? They get in behind the closed doors when the appropriations talks are happening. They are able to give funds to fund campaigns of key politicians and that sort of thing. They can go to both sides of the aisle, right? While we're voting for one or the other, they're voting for both. And honestly, I don't think it's talked about. Like you said, it's just not. It has to be. There's many things that are influencing policy that are out there, but that's one of the things, right? There's a whole huge industry, and I argue an industrial complex that exists, and that's out there, and there's a profit motive to it. There's companies that want to get contracts, so they want to get more contracts, so they want to get the maintenance contracts for the contracts they already get, so they want to get the contract to upgrade whatever they first installed in the first place. So it just gets on and on and on. Growth, it puts it in this growth pattern, right? And I honestly didn't think that's not talked about enough. In fact, we talked about this the whole time right now, and we didn't talk about it until right now with your question, right? But I honestly think that there are different places that bring it up. It's being brought up more and more, so that's good. I honestly think whenever a sort of immigration bill is brought into play and you're talking, especially comprehensive immigration reform, you bring it up, you have to bring in that part of it. That has to be a part of the conversation. Omitting that, which is the way that has been. In that 2013 comprehensive immigration bill, if you look at 1,000 pages, you'll find not only $45 billion going to the border, you also have earmarked companies like Sikorsky, 15 Black Hawk helicopters, blah, blah, blah. You have specific companies that are earmarked in the bill that if the bill passes, they're gonna get these contracts. So that's how instilled it is. And then I forget the numbers, I calculated, crunched the numbers before, but when that bill thought it might be passing, these companies, a bunch of companies started, if you look at their lobbying efforts, it's just I can't remember the numbers, they're pretty astronomical. I was surprised by them. Every day, they're just pounding the pavement, trying to get the bill passed and getting, whatever they want in the bill. So when that's not discussed, it just goes under the, AFSC has done a ton of, investigate, by AFSC, I would recommend that. That's one of the groups that has been doing a lot of work looking at the companies and then investigate. If you go to investigate, they name the companies and they profile the companies, and they talk about the different contracts the companies get. They have a whole section on border and surveillance. So I would definitely recommend AFSC. Their work is pretty, their work is pretty on the backyard. So,
We also have a lot of community organizing in Denver.
Oh,
what's that?
They have a lot of community organizing in Denver.
Oh, yeah, I know that too. I had communication with the AFSC here. So.
We have time for one last question. If anyone has one?
I have one if no one else does.
Sure. We'll let-
I'm curious what you think about, like, you've interviewed agents, obviously, and so do you think it's possible to kind of like burn the system from the inside? And like, do you think it's possible to like have you seen? I mean, it sounds like you've seen maybe really tiny bits of possibility, but with that one example you shared, like he ended up leaving. I don't think that agent was like going back in and trying to, you know, get like unionize or something, or like do something that would build solidarity amongst them.
Probably don't want to hear about that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's very similar to police unions, so I can imagine. But yeah, so I guess I'm curious, like, what you think about that, and if you think that's a possibility with your experiences and the people that you've talked to, like, could we really, like, you know, change the hearts and minds of ICE agents and see what happens?
I'm sorry I mean, maybe there's a certain parameter I think that agents can go in, but they go further than that. They have to uphold like this whole kind of system. It's a top-down command structure. Now, that said, you know, I'll talk to agents who are like, oh, you know, when I get people, I'll go buy a Burger King and then bring it to them. You know, so you'll hear stuff like that. There's one agent that in my first book that I talked to got fired. He got fired when he probably went over that limit, and he was I should send you. Anybody who wants, I can send you the PDF of the book. You know, and there's a chapter in it, which I would. But in this chapter, I go more into detail. But it's an agent who expresses he loves his Mexican heritage and expresses that to another agent. His grandmother's from his mom's from Chihuahua, and the other agent totally misinterprets it and reports him. He also has the belief that marijuana should be legalized or drugs should be legalized. That would be an answer to the drug war, and he expresses that. So he gets reported for saying that while he's with his other agent, and the other agent ends up reporting him. There's a longer story to that involves another agent, but that gets too complex in a novel. But he ends up having to face like these investigators, Homeland Security investigators, who interrogate him. They ask him if he's loyal to the country. Is he loyal to the Mexico? Is he loyal? He gave me the exact transcript, so I got to do I got to copy it word for word the questions they were asking. Like, are you they asked him if he was a socialist.
Classic.
Yeah, and so that happened, and then he was still working, and then they called him in maybe a couple months later, and they asked him to remove his gun belt. So if you go in and you're asked to remove your gun belt, right, you're done. And then according to him, they not only did that, he had to take off his shirt, and they paraded him around the station, and so by the time I interviewed him, he was pretty pissed, right? And he came from a really interesting background. Like, he got the job to begin with because remember Circuit City?
Oh my God.
Yeah, it went under like in 2006 or 2007 or something like that. Right when the Border Patrol was doing this big hiring surge, his uncle was in the Border Patrol, and so he was like, okay, I can make $70,000. You know, my first year, I'm gonna try it, you know, and then that's how we got into the Border Patrol. Like so many, so many end up in the Border Patrol that way. So basically, to me, that's a story of parameters, you cross them, or I guess in his case, he could have said that, but if he's reported about it, and next thing you know, you're gone. So it seems difficult. It seems like there's, I think, like in the situation I talked about with Brendan Lenahan, he obviously his heart shifted in that moment, right? And it was so obvious. But even to this day, he doesn't admit it. Like, I asked him, did you quit the Border Patrol because of this? And he was like, ooh, you know, I think, okay, maybe you didn't, but I think you did, right? I think you did, you know, and that's not the only story, but he has all these other stories that he writes about. And it's like, I think you quit because of this. And he's like, no, I just wanted to go to school. Maybe that's the case, I don't know, but it seems like if your heart and mind shifts, that you quit. That's what happens. But maybe, like, oh, one more quick story and then on. There's another agent I interviewed who was I mentioned this earlier at lunch. He was very much a dissenting agent who contacted me on the side when I was doing Border Patrol Nation. And it was very interesting because he's an expert sharpshooter with a gun, but he hates guns. So he's a Border Patrol agent who's a sharpshooter that hates guns. Yes, you heard that. And so he also hated the Border Patrol. He hated them. He hated them with every fiber. Like all he did, I sat with him for hours. And all he did was like, I hate the Border Patrol. When I get out, I'm going to write this whole thing about it, but I have to stay in because I have my kids, I have my house, I have food. And then he told me a story about how he would try to do what you're saying. So during his trainings, the gun trainings, he would slip in slides from No More Deaths, the humanitarian
Oh my God,
organization.
really?
But he got reprimanded for doing that. And he would, like, when he was doing his trainings at what's it called, the gun training center, I guess. The gun training center, or there's a specific word, I'm sorry. He would, just make comments while he was doing it. He'd slip in comments. So he's an example of somebody I think who tried to do it. He's retired now. And he has written a scathing op-ed about the Border Patrol. That got him apparently into a lot of trouble. He's an example. But I think it's difficult to do that.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. It was great. I do have a couple of books in my bag, and I think everyone, I know a lot of people already have them, but if anybody wants a book, I just wanted to let you know that we have just a few.
Especially if anyone in my class doesn't have theirs yet. There's probably one person.
I think I can go.
So a few of my students read, I haven't read it.
Oh, yeah. Yep. I like it.
Yeah, I've read it. I